Hey everyone, I just wanted to talk a little about tier lists and what they mean. What do people mean when they say this is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier meme, tier S, and how you can use this. But the reality is, I think, often when you look up decks on YouTube, you know, they'll sort of, the streamer will tell you their win rate percentage for their games, but the reality is that's a very small sample size. To really see the strength of a deck, you want aggregate statistics. And what these services do, we have HS Replay here on this window, and I have the Vicious Syndicate report on this window. Is they aggregate all the statistics up for people playing the decks at certain ranks, and they see which ones have the best win rate, and they put them in categories. The highest is usually tier 1, then there's tier 2, tier 3, and then tier 4. So Vicious Syndicate also uses this same scale. So tier 1, so I prefer Vicious Syndicate's cutoffs because they're a lot more consistent. But you can see, I think part of the problem with the stuff is if you go to like Platinum, for example, you have a bazillion tier 1 decks. So it makes a lot more. But that's the reality is at the low ranks, you can have a tier 1 win rate with a lot of different decks. But so Vicious Syndicate uses HS Replay kind of has a lot more arbitrary cutoffs, which I don't really quite understand. You can see a top 1,000 here, the 52% win rate ones. It looks like it's 53 a lot, but I'm pretty sure I saw a 53% one time in the tier 2. Let's say if we go to Platinum, for example. Yeah, you can see we have 54. So they kind of use an arbitrary this, and it's sort of relative, which is a little bit confusing. But for most top pros, they're looking at legend level stats. Where Vicious Syndicate uses a more consistent one. So the Vicious Syndicate one is 52% above is tier 1. 50 to 52 is tier 2. 47 to 50 is tier 3. And anything below that is tier 4. So that is the general tier list. And the tier list uses ladder statistics. So that means, for example, a deck that has a low tier deck can actually be a really successful tournament deck. Let's go look at the biggest example of one of the strongest tournament decks, Quest DH. This has a 44.97% win rate on ladder. Really bad. But part of why is that? Now, this is a Diamond through Legend, so it is a high skill deck. But that being said, it's going to have a bad win rate. High one is because the reason why is it has a bad win rate against Ramp Druid and a bad win rate against Beast Druid, two of the most popular decks on the ladder right now. So the reality is if you have a really bad matchup against the most popular deck, even if you're crushing a lot of the other decks, you're going to have a tough time. And even interesting enough, it doesn't do well against some of a few of these, mainly Buff Paladin, which is an aggro deck kind of more designed to beat Ramp Druid, but it also it happens to farm the Quest Fells. So that's an example of, so just because a deck has a low tier list doesn't mean it's objectively bad. One thing also to note, remember this is across all people. So let's say we look at Platinum on HS Replay here, you can see that there are a lot of decks with a really, really high win rate. And that's the reality. And you can see what are the common themes of these. Almost all of these are tempo-based decks that sort of spend their mana, play minions, get ahead on board, and push for advantage. Quest Hunter is the kind of the first deck that is not really a tempo-based deck. But Libram Paladin is kind of tempo, but it's also kind of mid-range. It's not as sort of board heavy as Taunt Druid and Beast Druid. But you can see even like Freeze Elemental Shaman, Aggro Elemental Shaman. So, and then Bell Druid's kind of the first one that isn't really a tempo-based deck. So that's what I always say. If you're trying to get to Legend for the first time, the most people have success with tempo-based decks. And part of the reason why, and this is why, while statistics are super useful, you don't necessarily discredit your knowledge is tempo-based decks are what they consider a high skill floor, where they're very easy to get most of the value out of. To play aggro at the highest level, you still need to be good at the game. But to play it at the mid level, if you know how to spend your mana, you know how to play minions, you know how to take occasional value trades, you can get to legend just with that. But if you look at top 1,000, you could see over sort of since they added Okami, there's only really one top 1,000 legend. Interestingly, that's Tauntred. And even what's interesting for me, someone like me, is I don't see much Tauntred at all. And it might just be because people think it's boring. But sometimes these decks like Tauntred, and Tauntred is considered kind of the lower skill version of Beast Druid. Beast Druid is a much more popular at the high ranks. And this is top 1,000 legend. So this could have some biases. For example, let's say players at top 1,000 to top 600 do well Tauntred, but then as they get to top 500, top 400, kind of it might drop off. Where Beast Druid tends to go see play all the way to the highest level. So they could have that bias. I don't really know. I don't have the stats. I haven't played Tauntred. But that's what my first instinct as a player who doesn't seem Tauntred. But it might be really it might be really good, and just nobody wants to play it because all the pros on their high horse think it's low skill. So that's what's interesting. So you could see another great example. Now you can see at top 1,000 it does okay, but if you look at Diamond through Legend, Mozaki Mage is a very low skill. It's very hard at first, and it's a very high skill ceiling of a deck. So at Diamond through Legend, this deck does really, really bad. 45% win rate. Go to top 1,000 Legend, it does okay, 49% win rate. And if you're a Pocket Train, it's busted. So Pocket Train is one of the best Mozaki Mage players in the world, if you don't know. So it's a thing of reality is certain decks, if you put in the time, you can do really well with them if you're a really good player. So just because, remember, the tier list is across all players. If you look at an individual, I might have really good success with a tier 3 deck, or even and do poorly with a tier 1 deck because I haven't put the time in the tier 1, but I have put the time into the tier 3, or I like playing the game a certain way. So remember, just because you play a 54% win rate deck does not mean you will have a 54% win rate. That means on average across all players within this category, people always have a 54% win rate. Somebody has a 60% win rate. Somebody has a 48% win rate. That's the general. So, but on average, it's generally better if you don't know where to start to find a high tier deck. So if you're trying to get to Legend or you don't know what decks to play, I recommend a tier 1 or tier 2 deck. If you go below tier 3, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. But you could still do it. So, for example, Ramp Druid is not a deck that I automatically, even before, recommend for people to get to Legend. But it's fun, right? Because it's got Kazakhstan, it's got Ramp. It's a lot of fun. So you can say, screw the tier list. I'm going to play my tier 3 deck, and I'm going to get to Legend. So I think, just like I said, just because a deck is not the top tier doesn't mean you can choose it. But I've noticed, though, my Ramp Druid win rate has gone down a lot since Kazakhstan. Ironically, Kazakhstan makes Ramp Druid stronger, but the meta is so warped around Ramp Druid. So what this means, and so this is why sometimes a low tier deck can get nerfed, because just because its win rate isn't strong, the meta can be super warped around it. So Ramp Druid is a good example where the meta, you can see almost all the top decks are decks that beat Ramp Druid. So Burn Shaman, I think, might be favored against the new Kazakhstan. The old version it wasn't, but Tauntred beats Ramp Druid, Beast Druid beats Ramp Druid, and then I think so you have these sort of aggro decks. Let's see, Buff Paladin's not doing as well at top 1,000 Legend right now, interestingly enough. But the bottom line is the meta is very much warped around the Ramp Druid. So the tier list, just because some that currently has a low tier list, the meta could shift and all of a sudden it can go crazy. For example, let's say a new card that makes you could have one new card that makes Ramp Druid really good against aggro. All of a sudden it's tier S. Or let's say all of a sudden you have a card that makes Kazakhstan terrible. All of a sudden it goes down. Or let's say all of a sudden, for example, a deck that crushes aggro so badly and does okay against Amp-Druid is like Questfell, that nobody wants to play aggro anymore. Well, then all of a sudden Ramp-Druid stock can rise a lot. So there's a lot of things that can happen to the meta that make the tier list change independent of sort of the in a vacuum strength of the tier list. So, but yeah, like I said, so we have tier 1, tier 2. When people say tier S, I don't know if there's an objective cutoff point for tier S, but usually, so in the Vicious Syndicate power rankings, they often have the power score and they have the frequency score. So you can see Beast Druid is 100% power, but it's underplayed. So the stats say you should play more Beast Druid generally. But people don't want to play Beast Druid because it's no Ramp Druid. Ramp Druid's the blast. But if a deck usually is both the highest power and frequency score, meaning it's often very played and nobody can, like, so it's everywhere, it's powerful and people can't counter it, that's generally, and it has, maybe usually it's over 54% win rate at competitive ranks. That's when people usually say it is an S tier deck. So if there's an S tier deck, often you can either play the S tier deck or you can play something bad. I think Wild had that for a while, where they had a deck that was SNP Warlock, where you could do infinite SNPs, and when people played it well, their win rate was just obscene. It was just off the charts. So sometimes decks just come that nothing can beat, and you can either play that deck or you can play a worse deck. And there's no competitive reason to not play that deck when you have these decks that just literally beat everything. And that can happen sometimes. And that's when people, what you do is you go on Twitter, you go on Reddit, you go on YouTube, and you complain, and then it gets fixed. That's what I've learned. So in general. So anyways, all right. So yeah. So bottom line is that's kind of the tier list explained. Remember, different decks can do well at different ranks. So often, if I'm making a YouTube video, sometimes I'll make videos for decks at different ranks to sort of see, like, so a deck that I might make a YouTube video might be competitive at Diamond through Legend, but might kind of go down in the ranks at the higher ranks. So it's a thing of there's lots of different tiers. Feel free, if you're curious in any of my YouTube videos, if you're like, what tier list is this on the competitive ranks? Now, sometimes when I'm making a new video, it's the reality is you don't have the stats. So if a deck is really new, hip, hopping, and fresh, which you want the hip, hopping, and fresh decks before everyone else is playing, right? If a deck is broken, you want to be the first on this. The reality is we don't have the big aggregate statistics to show. So you kind of have to use initial data, but I think if you're looking for sort of time-tested decks, you can go on HS Replay, you can go on the Vicious Syndicate report, and you can find different tier lists and find a deck that's the right tier for you. So anyways, I just know people sort of ask about the tier list, wanted to give that, thought that would be helpful. So hope you guys like that kind of style video. If you have another topic you'd just like me to casually talk about, just feel free to leave a comment for a video. I'm trying to do a video every day. So just try it. So if you have a video you want me to talk about, a topic you want to talk about, feel free to leave it in the comments below.